of time. We know time is precious and you pay for it. You pay by coming here by your amazing precious time, so thank you. It's not lost on us. I'm Jerry Apple. Yes, questions are ready? This one right here.
Like this one. Is there a zone of bad and good? Like if I get too far forward, does it do that blurry noise? Thank you. I'm Jerry Young. I'm one of the ProductTank San Francisco co-organizers here. We're totally thrilled to have you here. It's so awesome that so many of you have spent your time and energies to get here. I want to say right off, I apologize for wearing a hat. I would love to be able to say that it's in honor of our amazing speaker tonight, who is from UC Berkeley. She's a professor there, Dr. Neela Saleha. I apologize if I didn't get that right. And it says, it looks like Berkeley. It looks like the new branding for Berkeley, by the way. But it's, if anyone's seen it, but if you notice, it's actually Barcelona. And it's just a bad excuse. I just have really bad hat hair. So, but I just have to always be honest. So, like I said, it's really awesome. Let's get to know each other really quickly. And I'm always bad at like orchestrating these. Raise your hand if this is your first ProductTank San Francisco that you're attending, and keep your hand up. Oh my gosh, I would say quickly about 50%. I'm not the best product manager. You're all better. You could all do that quick calculation better than me. Tell me. Raise your hand if this is your second. Keep up your first hand if you're here. How about if this is your second product? Okay, raise your hand. And if this is your third plus? Awesome, amazing. So 50% or so is first. Great, hands down. Other quick question, how many people live in San Francisco? Again, about half. Hands down. How many people are coming from the Bay Area but not San Francisco? Very nice, thank you. That's probably a longer commute than my next question. How many of you are coming from outside of the Bay Area or internationally or another part of the States? One. Where? Sacramento, thank you. It probably took you less time than coming from San Jose, but thank you. You still get credit. Oh, and where are you from?
I live in both Colorado and San Francisco.
Well, thank you, I appreciate that. Is there a ProductTank in Colorado?
I mean, not in Colorado, not right.
Or in Denver, Aurora?
I'll find one though when I'm back.
Okay, or you could found one. Awesome, thank you. Well, thank you all for coming in. Just appreciate it. It takes a collaboration, it takes a team. Some people ask us, hey, do you work for GitHub? Or you spend all your time, you're a full-time worker for ProductTank. We are a volunteer group that's just focused on the community. In the room here are two of my co-organizers. Our actual lead is Glenn. Glenn, stand up. And thank you. And then Catherine.
We know that's short-lived, Jerry.
And then Catherine is also. So we're all co-organizers. We're just all volunteers, and we do this for the love of the community. We have other organizers that you can see behind me, Melissa, who's currently helping us remotely from New York, and we also have Mike as well. So reach out, talk to Glenn, talk to Catherine. If you want to volunteer, help, learn more, please talk to them, come talk to myself as well. For those of you who are new to ProductTank, which was about a third, maybe a half, as I mentioned, ProductTank is a global group that we're focused on how do we help the product community, and it doesn't just mean product managers, it's product adjacent and just building businesses. And how do we build a community, how do we basically share, care, and learn together? And that's what we're trying to do here. ProductTank, as I mentioned, is a global meetup group. There are 160 odd cities that have ProductTanks. We're going to found a new one in Aurora or Denver maybe soon. And the amazing thing is within this 160, there's 150,000 members. Certainly there's active members and non-active members, but still pretty powerful and it's amazing. And last meeting, I think we had 2 or 3 from the Netherlands and it's really interesting to hear and share about these areas. get involved. You hear me plug that quite a bit. Get involved in your local community. If you live outside of the area, get involved in this community. We'd love anyone to help us volunteer, organize, speak, sponsor. It would be awesome as well. There's going to be a survey at the end. Catherine's going to remind you of it. Please fill it out. Give us your feedback on how the event went, but also let us know if you want to opt in and just have a conversation. There's no commitment. Just let us know. We really appreciate it. Oh, and then one thing I forgot to mention is you could get involved by going to this link. We'll post these up in the channel as well, and you can get involved at a broader, not just this chat, but get involved in Mind the Product completely. Mind the Product and ProductTank are related. There is an amazing Mind the Product Slack out there. There's other events, there's learnings, there's shares, there's jobs, there's everything. It's free. Go ahead and join it. It's a great resource for everyone. And then also through Mind the Product, there's product training. You can get this QR code, and it's around product management fundamentals, metrics, all the things you would expect to come from it. So if this is an opportunity for you to determine something you want to start upskilling on, or something you want to learn more about, or if your product adjacent, you're really thinking about diving even deeper into product management, that's great. But I think it's it's valuable things, because ultimately the day, it's just good business fundamentals, and it's not specific to an important role. It's important about how do you value business and how do you determine your business success. And of course, this would not be at all possible without, of course, our speaker, who we're going to hear from soon, but from our amazing sponsors who are both today, GitHub for this amazing venue, and from Storytel AI. So a word from our sponsors. I'd like to introduce Chris Butler to tell us about.
Thank you. Thank you for everybody being here today. Just wanted to remind everybody that, at GitHub, we basically are building probably the most widely adopted AI tool today, mostly focused to developers. And it's made really big impact on the way that developers do their work on a day-to-day basis. But I did want to just mention very briefly, since this talk is mostly going to be about kind of the using of LLMs when it comes to product practice. I'm actually a staff product operations manager here at GitHub, working with the Copilot team. And so some of the things that I've started to do, and I just want to remind people that there's a lot of opportunities across every type of role that's out there. We've started to use LLMs, Copilot, Workspace, a bunch of other things, not only to, don't tell the leads that I work with that I'm helping them summarize weekly minutes based on this, or meeting summarization for really important action items and summaries, and you probably get access to these types of tools. We've been starting to do things that are a little bit more in depth around what that means. This idea of just like meeting planning, actually using these systems to role play the meeting actually taking place, to be able to find problems. Writing initiatives, how do we have best practices around the way we actually do our work? And every leader always wants to raise the bar, quote unquote, so how do we do that in some way that's really valuable? Even generating content, marketing content. I think we can imagine a world inside of GitHub where eventually everything that you do inside of the PRs that you create end up turning into marketing content eventually. And then finally, just even automating process. And so I think this is a really exciting kind of world that we're living in now, where maybe the drudgery work that we would usually do is going to start to be taken care of by these tools and allow us to actually do maybe the deeper thinking that we need to do around not only strategy, but the way we actually work together better. So with that, I just wanted to say thank you for all being here, and I'm looking forward to the talk. Thank you.
Awesome, thank you so much, Chris, and thank you to GitHub. Our next sponsor, who sponsored our amazing food and beverages, is the company Storytel AI, and the CEO and founder here is Drodio.
Here with my co-founder Erica, so I'm gonna bring Erica up as well.
Hello, hello.
How was the food, by the way? It's okay?
Best Costco pizza you've had in a while?
We tried to make it not just pizza, so did you see there were anchovies, by the way? Okay, awesome. I know Jerry saw the anchovies and dolmas and yeah, there was salmon. The salmon didn't last long. We'll have to bring more salmon. Well, not only do we bring food for meetups, but we are founding a company called Storytel.ai, and we wanted to do a demo. So what's more dangerous than doing a live demo? We are going to tell you a little bit about Storytel. But first, like any good product manager, we wanted to segment our audience. And we think about AI in 4 buckets. And we really are here to talk to the people that are AI curious or AI enthusiast. If you are AI cautious or AI avoidant, that is totally okay. You probably won't be very excited about what we've got to show you today. Let's share with you the core building team. We're early, we're angel stage. Eric and I are co-founders. This is our LinkedIn QR code. So I'm Drodio, I'm an XYC founder. My last company was a DevOps company.
I'm Erica Anderson, and I'm really interested in humane technology, so we'll share a bit about our humane tech meetup as well. And we love product people. I think early stage startups, there's no one better to talk to than someone who works in product. And something that's really special about your role is that you interface with so many other roles. It's really cross-functional, and what you have to do is tell stories, and often different versions of those stories to each of those roles.
And so let's try using Storytel together for a minute. I'm going to get out of here, and I'm going to pull up Storytel. Storytel is an enterprise platform that we're trying to make really easy for any knowledge worker to use. It's a layer that sits on top of your company's data and helps you bring out the story that your data is trying to tell. In fact, we make it so that you can see here we've got work-life play. We've got a number of prompts for different personas. We are learning from our users. There's 102,000 people that have registered to use Storytel, and we are learning from those users. So for example, I was talking to David earlier. He's a product program manager, and these are a bunch of prompts that we are seeing our users use when they are doing product work. I wanted to show you one of them. I'm going to go to Product Manager, and I'm going to look at these prompts. One of them is to create a PRD based on content. So let's imagine something. Nilu is about to come up and give a talk. Well, it turns out that Nilu wrote a very dense and intelligent white paper on using machine learning with medicine. Now, I have uploaded that into Storytel. And the way that I did that is I literally just said, upload that into Storytel. In fact, I can show it to you. It's right here. This is what she wrote. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, you know what, I really would like you to explain this to me like I'm 5. And we can ask Storytel to do this. Now you can see that we don't just have like a regular explain to me like I'm 5 prompt here. We've got a pretty sophisticated prompt that we've used. Again, we're learning from our users. And so this is an opportunity for me to understand this like I'm 5. Now I might actually want to understand why it matters, or go deeper, or rewrite this for a more technical audience. Storytel makes it really easy for me to do those types of things. But more importantly, it's not just about doing the kinds of things that I can do with ChatGPT, but it's about being able to do it with all of my data, all the data that is in my company. And let's imagine that Nilu and I worked together, and she said, hey Drodio, I really would like for you to go write a PRD based on this paper because I want to turn it into a product. And so we can use Storytel to help us. Chris was talking about using Storytel as a product leader. So I'm going to go into this product manager part of Storytel, and I'm going to say, create a PRD based on this content. I'm going to upload the content. So we'll let Storytel ask us for the white paper. It's going to summarize and then create a draft PRD. We can see here that it's got information about the project details to fill in, the objective, success metrics, assumptions, milestones to fill out, requirements with user stories, user interaction and design, open questions, out of scope. This is the kind of thing that you can do with Storytel, not just with one document, but hundreds or thousands of your company's documents. This is the kind of thing that we're doing. We're putting a layer on top of the data swamps that live inside your company so that you can start to bring it alive. So that's just a really, really quick overview of Storytell. We wanted to tell you a little bit about an upcoming webinar. It's not for product managers exactly, it's for technical writers, but if you have a technical writer on your team that would like to become a more effective technical writer through AI, this is a QR code for you to be able to email yourself a reminder. So if you want to grab that, just put in your email address instead of the default, and it'll give you the link to sign up for that on Meetup on our webinar page. Leave that up for 1 second. And then we also wanted to share with you a community that is like ProductTank, but for founders, and it's called Founder Culture. So if you are a product manager at a large company and you think you want to become a founder someday, Founder Culture also does meetups, a couple hundred founders. There is a meetup that Erica will tell you about.
Yeah, so like I said, humane technology is a real passion of mine. And we're actually, our next session, I told a few of you about it, is around humane design principles. And we're following the Foundations in Humane Technology course that a nonprofit Center for Humane Technology created. But it's very unconference kind of style, you know, breakout sessions and actually creating things together as opposed to just talking.
And then the next night, there is a very technical AI ML. This is a group, a meetup group called Building the Future of AI. Talk by an AI researcher, loss of plasticity in deep continual learning. This is going to be a very technical talk. If you're interested in that, come to that. Those are in San Mateo. This one will also be hybrid. You can join on Zoom. That's a little bit about what Founder Culture is up to, trying to help founders who are interested in building world-changing companies. Okay, thank you so much for having us.
Thank you.
Awesome, thank you. Great, thank you GitHub and thank you Storytell AI. So, piece of resistance, given this amazing backdrop and background, so I think we all can see the relevance, things that are going on. There's a lot of trends that are going on, there's a lot of conversations, there's a lot of endless meetups that are around AI, ML, LLM products. So I think this continues to be extremely relevant, extremely complex. You see the technologies infused everywhere. So both in terms of enabling ourselves as product managers and product adjacent roles, as well as deploying it into our solutions so that we solve the problems and the jobs we've done for any of our customers. It is my amazing privilege, and I will have to read this a little bit because it is amazing and I don't want to mess it up, is that our speaker is an assistant professor in the School of Information at UC Berkeley. Go Bears! Thank you. She studies human-computer interaction with her research spanning education to healthcare to restorative justice. That's an amazing breadth. Her research interests are social computing, human-centered AI, and more broadly, human-computer interactions. Her work has been published and received awards in the premier venues, and our speaker gave me all the acronyms, and I just think, I'm going to spell them out because they're so impressive. It's important. The Association of Computing Machinery Conference in Human Factors and Computing Systems, ACMCHI, Conference of Computer-Supported Cooperative Work, the CSCW, and the Empirical Methods in Natural Language Processing. So these are amazing. I did some reading on this. I encourage you to look these things up. Absolutely amazing. And if that wasn't enough, she's been covered in little things like VentureBeat, Wired, and The Guardian. Those ones that are a little harder to remember. She is a WT Grant Foundation Scholar for her work on promoting equity in student assignments and algorithms, and a member of the advisory board of generative AI, and this tiny little startup named NVIDIA. I'm not sure if anyone's ever heard of it. Even though we recognize that she does go to Cal now, which is a good thing. She teaches for Cal, or has used lately. She is from this little PhD thing from Stanford. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Assistant Professor Neil.
Thank you, Jerry. That was very kind. I'm very funny. Thank you. Thank you all for spending your afternoon with me. We saw some really cool demos, and that's really what I'm going to talk about. I'll take a step back. As academics, that's what we like to do, and just think a little bit more broadly about what's going on here, what's happened so far, and where are we headed. So, what I'm going to talk about is large language models. It's been about 2 years since ChatGPT came out. We've all tried them, and what they mean for work and what they can mean for product management. So like Jerry said, my name is Nidu Farasadehi. I go by Nidu. I've been a professor at UC Berkeley since 2018. And I've been doing a lot of work on thinking about human-centered AI and what that means. And so I'm going to come back to this quote, but this is something that has just stuck in my mind since the first time I read it. And it's a quote by Russell Ackoff. The quote is, "Managers are not confronted with problems that are independent from each other, but with the dynamic situations that consist of complex systems of changing problems that interact with each other. I call such situations messes." And this will be very familiar to anyone who's done product. You're always dealing with messes. And we're going to talk about what AI can mean for that mess. There are some estimates that about 80% of data in all organizations is messy, unstructured, and rarely used. And product people are expected to always know what that data is, what the trends are, what we should be doing with that data. And so we'll get into that. But first, this is what we're talking about. I really like this XKCD comic because I think it sets the stage. Whenever I'm talking about AI, I always bring up this comic. So there's this guy who's going like, "This is your machine learning system?" And the other one's like, "Yeah, you pour the data into this big pile of linear algebra, then collect the answers on the other side." And the big question is, what if the answers are wrong? And the person says, "Well, just stir the pile until they start to look right." And that's what we're dealing with at the most basic level. We're dealing with linear algebra that you can keep stirring until it starts to look right. But it becomes profoundly powerful as it starts to get right. And so that's something that we have to be thinking about. And this is something that people across different kinds of organizations and even venture capital is starting to look at as well. So there was this article that came out of Andreessen about the second wave of AI, that is less about generating new stuff, but it's about synthesizing what we already have. And that's something that I think is really, really important, and something that we will see more and more of as we move past the initial stage when we were just starting to learn what models can do, and into the stage where they get really deeply embedded in everyday workflows. So I believe that we are at a stage where we're going from the internet era, or where connectivity and information sharing led to really an exponential growth of information and our ability of what to do with information, to a quantum era, where it's not just that we have unlimited amounts of information, but now we finally have the tools to also be able to process and synthesize that information. And that's why I think everything is going to change, but it's also going to change really slowly and in really weird ways, and it's going to take a lot of work to get there. So I'm going to share one project that me and my students have worked on at UC Berkeley, and I'm going to turn this into more of a conversation than me just presenting the work. But we were, about a year ago, starting to look into what would it look like if we used AI more for data synthesis than for just word generation. So what if we took these models and we took all this unstructured, messy data, and we tried to use the models to make sense of that data? So I'll pause here and see if anyone's tried to do that. So show of hands if you've tried to upload any of your own data or run a model over any of your own data. All right, so about half the room. And we saw some demos on how to do that today as well. You can go try them out. But I want to hear from the people who have tried it. What has your experience been like? What's gone well and what has not worked?
There's always structure. If you have a data set that's not structured in the way that the model is used to, you get garbage out of it, or it just can't read it.
Okay, so the model needs to know what the structure of this information is. Otherwise, it doesn't understand it, and then the output doesn't make sense. Okay, what else?
It's kind of like a question you showed earlier.
Can you say more?
I mean, you expect magic to happen, but just, somehow like understand that it doesn't. And you're like messing around with it. You're kind of feeding something different, back to the comment about maybe more structure, et cetera. But instead of the synthesis, you're spending, all right, these are more kind of spending on like what data collect and fit into the model. So you're working on that part.
Mm-hmm. So you're expecting magic, but it's not really working out, so you have to iterate a lot. How do you know it's not working?
Well, you just what it does, it doesn't read that.
So the output doesn't make sense. What else? What have other people's experiences been? Yes.
Setting up a testing framework to answer that question turns out to be the hardest question to answer, because you're literally asking fundamental product questions in trying to evaluate the effectiveness of the promise. Right?
So evaluation is really hard. Yeah.
And many times answers we get from after the prompts are different, and sometimes you get answers and then that's something you were expecting, then you would use the same prompt for a different thing, but it doesn't work. Like let's say if I upload a data and I ask some questions, sometimes it gives me a right answer. If I ask the same question to a different set of data which has a little bit different fields, then it will give a different answer. Then maybe
Right.
in a different direction altogether, then get lost.
Right. That's a really good point. So because these models are non-deterministic or stochastic, they don't necessarily do the same thing again. And I think that that's a really big key to how this will all play out. I think we're moving past the era of software where the software was always deterministic. You knew exactly what you would get out. If you ran it 100 times, you would get the same thing. Into an era where a lot of things are going to be really noisy. And evaluation is going to be really hard. So a colleague of mine, Joe Gonzalez, and another colleague of mine, Joe Hellerstein, started a company. It's called Run LLM. And they did all these blog posts about a year ago where they were saying, everyone's evaluating their LLMs off of vibes. And this can't work. So, we have to have some kind of benchmarking here. And a lot of people have tried to do LLM evaluations and benchmarking. And just a week ago, I saw a blog post come out of their company, and the title of the blog post was "In Defense of Vibe-Based Evaluations." After a year of trying to create benchmarking, they had realized that even if they really put a lot of effort into a good benchmark, it still didn't mean that their end users felt that this was a better LLM. And what the end users were doing were going in, asking a few questions, and seeing how it looks like and how it feels and just the vibes. And the blog post was saying if that's how the users are evaluating it, then maybe that's not so bad. Maybe we should be thinking more about that. So I think there are some fundamental things that are going to change, yes.
Another big problem is often like 95% of, you may get situations where 95% is accurate and 5% is not. And it's easy to, one, if you don't really understand the domain, to just think it's 100% accurate, because you're seeing a bunch of things that make accurate. And detecting which parts are not, hallucinations is another problem. And so I think that the veracity of what you received and can be fully trusted, and in some domains, you can't afford to have like 85% confidence or even 90% confidence. You need like 98, 99, 100. So I think that's another big problem.
That's exactly true. So even if I know that I'm 99% of the time correct, I don't know what those 1% are. And that's another really big problem. Because our brains are just not used to tools that work that way. If I drive a car around LA and it's working pretty well, I expect that if I come to San Francisco, it'll work just as well. And that's how our brains function and how we think about tools. And now we're entering into an era where I really don't know why these models keep using the word "in the realm of something." Whenever I see an email that has in the realm, I know that it's AI generated because no person uses that word. But I don't know why the models keep using it. So it's going to be weird, and we're not going to be able to understand why. We have a lot of experiences in this. About 4 years ago, I started working on models used in really high-stakes settings because I was thinking, if these models are going to get better and more embedded, we have to know how to make them reliable. And so I thought to myself, let's take it to the extreme. What is a setting in which you absolutely cannot be wrong? And I thought, well, hospital settings. Because if it's life or death, then you absolutely cannot be wrong no matter how good the model is. And so we started looking at language models, early language models, translation models used in hospital settings. And one thing we learned was that Google Translate was widely used in hospitals across California. And so we started this study. Let's actually try this out with this group. So say you have a doctor, say you're a doctor, and your patient comes in, and you want to tell to your patient, hold your kidney medicine until you've had a chance to speak to your kidney doctor. So you just got their lab results back, and you have to give them this piece of information. Now your patient comes in, and they don't speak English, they only speak Mandarin. Now you have a choice here, which is to put that information into Google Translate and hand it to them. Or you could, go try to find a way to find a Chinese interpreter. Now let's do a show of hands. If you were that doctor, would you give the Google Translate output to your patient? Let's show of hands if that's a yes. Okay, I think about 30%. And what if it's a no? Okay, 70%. So this is really interesting for me because I usually talk about these things to a technical audience. And when I speak to a technical audience, almost no one raises their hand for a yes. Everyone's an absolutely no. But when I go and talk to doctors, because a lot of my collaborators are doctors, all of them do this routinely. And so I always use this as an example to say that the doctors are being super practical, and the technologists are thinking about it in this 0-1 numbers way. And it's interesting to see that product people sit somewhere in the middle, where we understand the tech, and yet we know the reasons why we need to be practical as well. Yes. Go.
Have you had a doctor put something like that into Google Translate and had somebody who speaks Chinese translate that into English for you?
So my colleague, Dr. Elaine Kung, who's at UCSF, has a lot of Chinese patients, and she does this all the time. She puts all her notes into Google Translate. And so a lot of the times the patient comes in with someone with them who may know some English, and so yes, they do that. But we did run this experiment where we actually tried using Google Translate to back translate. So I'll talk a little bit more about this a little bit later, but yes, sometimes people do things like that. Yeah.
Are they not worried about liability in case they get it wrong and they change their medication or something and they end up taking the medicine they're supposed to or vice versa? Could get
Yes, liability is a big issue. Yeah, absolutely.
The question I'm wondering is, how accurate have you found it? Share your speech.
I will. You're good.
I was going to ask, and I think I'm translating what I was talking about. I personally wouldn't directly translate it. I would translate it and not show it to the patient until I translate it back into English to see what it retranslated as. And then if it seems reasonable enough, perhaps I would show the original direct translation. Is that what back translating means?
Yes.
Okay.
So there's even a button in the middle of Google Translate for flipping it around.
So many doctors do that as opposed to directly translate.
Some do it, some do. Not all. We actually found a hospital somewhere in California where the guidance to doctors was to do that, to back translate. But you're completely right. There's absolutely no written rule anywhere, and the liability lies completely with the physician who did that.
One thing we could do is use a different translate to translate back.
That's a really good point. That likely will work better. Yeah.
Does that also be, because you're talking about human-centered AI, there's an angle which we can talk about, is the doctors rely on their nurses and on their staff to actually provide the actual support to patients. So even if they use Google Translate, it's dependent on the nurses to make the final translation for those patients. So the liability is slightly lower in an actual
guess in this scenario, the liability would be with the person who gave the incorrect information. So the example that I gave you was a sort of a trick question. It's one where Google Translate, at least up till 2021, was flipping the meaning. So hold your kidney medicine until you've spoken to your doctor was an actual sentence that someone was given in hospital discharge instructions that my colleague found. She had a big database of things that she had said to patients. So we ran it through Google Translate, translated it, had someone who understands that language look and rate, and there were about 8% of the sentences that were not only incorrect, but were incorrect such that they caused clinically significant harm. And the sentence that I said was one of those. It translated to keep your kidney medicine. And so this is an example of these sort of errors that are very hard for us to identify because we don't know when the model is going to be right and when it's going to be wrong. And even if we know a percentage of 8% of the time is wrong, that still doesn't help me on an individual basis when I'm working on with these models. And so I think, the next generation of tools that we use are going to be completely different, and everything about them is going to be different. And I think that means a lot for product managers. We're going to have tools that are stochastic, that are not always right, that you can't even really run an evaluation with because each time you run it, something different is going to happen. I think that's going to touch every aspect of the product. I think it's even going to touch pricing. Because so far we're so used to a per license or per seat pricing model because it was kind of the cost of running software was pretty much the same for each person who joined, right? But now we're at a point where it kind of depends on how much they use it. The models are actually the thing that's really expensive. And so we're seeing some startups do token-based pricing, or there's even one startup that's doing this really innovative thing where they're doing outcome-based pricing. So they're saying, we'll help you answer your support tickets, and we will take a percentage of how many support tickets we close. And so I think we're going to see more of that because we're going to see more and more tools that are more involved in the actual doing of the work than just being a tool that you use to do the work. I think we're going to see more and more, I think we're going to see less of those things that have become so standard where, those tables that every company has, where it's like our features and what the competitors' features are, and there are ticks in them, like we give you 20 gigabytes of storage, the other company gives you 10. I think that those are all a product of software that was very deterministic and very easy to measure. And we're going to see less and less of that. I think, ChatGPT and Gemini have been around for a while. There isn't a single table that compares them like that. And most people just go off of vibes, or they try it a few times. And I've heard some people who really like Gemini, and some people who really like ChatGPT. I'm sure some people love Storytel. And so I think that we're going to see a whole new way of how people, evaluate software and make decisions on what software to buy and how to use it. And there are going to be really, really important questions about reliability here. Because these are non-deterministic or stochastic systems, I think that reliability is going to be the most important thing. And the way that I think about reliability is two things: accuracy and verifiability. And so going back to this project that we started about a year ago, this is me and my students, we started to think about, okay, what is it going to look like if we use models for what we believe models do really well, which is go through lots and lots of data and find out the patterns, insights, or even take actions on behalf of the person. And so I teach HCI at Cal, so a lot of my students end up going into product roles or UX research roles. And so we said, let's try it out on something that we do all the time, which is go through user data and try to understand what people's pain points are, or what we should be building next, or those kinds of things. Now, I think conversational interfaces are great. I think they come very naturally to people, but I don't think the future will be a lot of one-shot interactions with models. I think that models are good at certain things, but for a lot of the workflows that we see people actually do, it's actually going to take longer forms of engagement with multiple different models or different kinds of algorithms. And so we said, okay, let's build 3 template workflows, and we call them widgets. And what each widget does is it takes some unstructured data and solves a problem for a potential product manager. So the first one is a Q&A widget. That one is just, you have your data, you can ask questions about it. The second was pain point tracker. So we said, let's say you have all of your data, say reviews from customers, and you want to know what are the main pain points that customers have and how have those pain points changed over time. So we made a widget that you can drag and drop over data, and it draws a graph for you. Here's your pain points that your customers mentioned, and here's how they've changed. And the third one, we call this one User Insights widget. This one takes a lot of qualitative data, and you can either ask it specific things that you want out of that qualitative data, or you can you can just say, just find out the main trends here, and it goes and it searches through all that data and it pulls it out. And it gives you a whiteboard, with each trend being one of those squares, and it puts sticky notes in it. So we thought of these three workflows as things that we think would be really helpful for product managers. And so I'm going to show you a video of the thing that we built. Now mind you, this was a research project mostly coded by students, so it's not... can we start playing it? Okay. I think we need to get rid of that thing. Awesome. Thank you. So this is what we ended up building. So there's a space here, and you can pull in data. We ran this study with Notion reviews. So we scraped App Store reviews from Notion that had 3 stars and below to test the pain point tracker widget. So I think if each one of these data points is a review that someone wrote on the App Store for Notion. And the task here was, it's impossible for someone to read all of these, but what if there was a widget, and the way you run it on this data is whatever data is in the middle is what these widgets will be run on. You kind of give it a name, and you can either give it specific pain points you want it to go look for, or you say you find the top 3. So when you run a widget over data, it starts to run, meaning that it's going through all the data, analyzing with an algorithm, and the output is the spreadsheet with, here are the top 5 pain points that everyone mentioned, and here are how those pain points have changed over time. So this is how many times each pain point was mentioned each month. And there's a graph here. You can see lagging and glitching on iPad was mentioned 5 times in August, and then it went down, so it probably got resolved. But another pain point, lack of intuitive design, is going up in Notion App Store reviews. This is the Q&A widget that I talked about, where you can ask questions from the data, like what are the biggest challenges with Notion AI? It goes through that data, puts together a response for you, and it tells you its sources. So that's where the verifiability comes in. And you can keep running these widgets. We try to make it really flexible because our goal was to see what will people do with these kinds of things. This is another example of the widget. This is more for qualitative interviews. So we actually got these off of YouTube. So there are reviews that someone did of the Notion app. These are YouTube video transcripts. So we took the transcript, and these were also very long. So we took tasks where like actually doing it manually would take hours and hours and hours, and we built widgets. So I think I'll do the user insights one. So you give it a name, you can give it specific topic areas that you want it to go look for in the data. Like, I want to know more about the calendar app, and I want to know what people are saying about the AI output, because Notion added an AI bot. And so it goes, analyzes the data, and puts it all together. And the output looks like this. So it makes a whiteboard where there's a box for each user, a little summary of that interview, and then all the questions that you had. It makes little sticky notes for each of those things, or anything that it finds in that data. So this is for user 2, what they said. And then there's a summary table at the end for each of the things that I was interested in and each of the users. What did I hear? All right, so this is what we built, and our goal was to see how do people use this? Is it useful? What can we learn from giving this to some product managers and having them use it for something that resembled a real world task? So if we could go back. Do you have a question?
So I have a question. And then what tool this is built on? This particular project?
We just built it from scratch. It's just a web app.
Okay. And how like the data that you're pulling off
Yeah.
and then you were running, that's great for these visualizations.
Yeah.
So how like from that is a qualitative or like taken from the different pieces of the data from the internet comments or Notion comments
Yeah.
that people have given.
Mhm.
From there I pulled up and then made this like
Yeah, so my students built this web app. They had two ways to bring data in. One was that you could just upload data. The other one was they wrote a script that you could sort of get reviews from the API with the Apple Store. They did that. It can scrape that, or it can take YouTube videos or things like that. Yeah. Any other questions about the tool? I'm going to share what we learned from running some studies with it.
How long did it take for your students to build it?
About 6 months.
So did you get what API folks use on? Is it a single one or you go try multiple?
So we tried a lot of different things, and they're not all LLMs. So our insight was that it would be more interesting if for each workflow we designed an algorithm for that workflow. So for instance, for the pain point tracker, there are multiple things that need to happen. The first is that you have all this data. You need to pull out what the main pain points are. Then you somehow need to cluster them because we need some understanding of what the groupings are. Then for each cluster, you need to count how many times they come up. And so we designed an algorithm that does that, and we tried a few different things. So the first thing we tried was, for each review, let's pull out the pain points. So one sentence for each pain point. Now we have a long list of sentences. Now let's use a clustering algorithm to cluster it. And then for each cluster, let's figure out what that pain point, what that cluster represents. And what ended up happening was that there was so much information lost because we did the summarization too early that it didn't really work. And so we tried something else. We just chunkified the text, so each chunk was about a paragraph. We made a vector for each of those paragraphs, and then we clustered the vectors. Now we had a bunch of clusters. Some of them represented pain points, some didn't. And the way we figured out which ones are pain points is that for each cluster, we would sample 2 or 3 of those clusters, and we would give it to an LLM, I think we used ChatGPT, and say, hey, do these couple sentences represent a pain point? And if they did, then we would sample a few more and figure out what that pain point was. And if it didn't, we would just throw away that cluster. And that worked better. And so that's part of my point here is that I think it's going to take a whole lot of work to figure out how to develop these workflows. It's going to take lots of algorithms. It's going to take different kinds of models that are good at different things. And we're going to move away from one-shot interactions with a single model, I think, towards figuring out what needs to be done and just designing an algorithm that does that really well. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I guess, yeah.
Cool. So for the user insights, we did a similar algorithm that we'd go through. There were 2 paths, right? One was if the user asked specific questions. The other one was if the user just said, find the top trends. And so we developed an algorithm for each of those. The Q&A was the easiest. That was just basic RAG. Any other questions? Yes.
Have you used the web scraping and that NLP, natural language processing to send data about that Notion API and
Yes.
other different websites?
Yeah, so the reviews were with the API from the App Store. Those were scraped that way. The YouTube videos, I think they just did it manually. They just took the transcripts and uploaded them. So we did a user study on this. We had 16 product managers spend about 2 hours doing a pretty realistic task with this. So we said, imagine that you're the product manager at Notion and you have all this data. And we want you to end up with basically a document or next steps for Notion. What should they focus on next? And we gave them access to all 3 widgets. We did a quick overview of them of how to use the widgets, and the data was already there. And we started to look at how they use it. What we found was that they used it to navigate large amounts of unstructured data. So most people used all 3 widgets. And I thought that was really interesting because with the amount of time that they had, about an hour, there was absolutely no way that they could actually go read all that information. But they made use of the widgets to navigate that large amount of information, find the patterns and what's important, and they use that to write up a document of next steps. We found that they had really different workflows, and I thought that was really interesting. And I think a big takeaway here is that this next generation of tools is going to require a lot of customization. Because this is a few of the workflows that people did. So the blue ones here are anytime someone used the user insights widget. The red ones are when they use the pain points widgets, Q&A is orange, and gray is when they try to do it manually, or they just like opened a few and just read it to get a feel for it. And so each one of these columns is one person's flow. So like this first one, this was someone who read the interviews, then picked a few of them, then brainstormed, and then just did the Q&A once to ask, what are the metrics? The second one started with user insights to get an overview of the data. Then they went to pain points and got an overview of that data. So they did a qualitative followed by a quantitative analysis. Then they went back to user insights and they ended with 2 questions. And then there were some people who did like really weird things and they did loops and they went back and forth. But each person had a completely different flow. And I thought that was really interesting because I think it teaches us something about what people do well and what models do well. I think the PMs relied a lot on their intuition and what they know contextually about the company, the business, the technology, and what needed to be done. And they used these as tools in different kinds of configurations. Another thing we found was that they did a lot of cross-verification. So anytime you see one of these sort of arrows that goes back and forth, they would like do one widget and then do the same thing on the same data or ask the question slightly differently and try to understand if it was right or not. And so I think we're starting to pick up on the behavioral patterns that we need to have to be able to work with these stochastic models is a lot of verification, a lot of trying things multiple different ways to see what happens. And so we found that there were 2 main ways of thinking that people used UDI for. And I forgot to say, I think the tool was called UDI. So they did divergent thinking, where they were branching out, generating multiple different kinds of solutions. And they did convergent thinking, where they were trying to converge everything together and prioritize. And we thought that they would probably use the widgets only for convergent thinking. Our initial hypothesis was that people are good at divergence and creativity, and models are good at synthesis and pattern matching and bringing everything together. But what we found in practice was that they used the widgets for both of those things. And so it was a lot more mixed and iterative than we expected. We found that they did use it a lot for brainstorming. They used it to come up with new ideas, come up with assumptions that they might have missed, and to discover new insights. And we found that they did do a lot of trust building through transparency. So one of the things that we did right off the bat was that anything that was generated with a source. So they could always validate, and they really appreciated that. But they also did other sorts of creative forms of validation where they would ask one widget to do something, then the other widget to do the same thing, and cross-validate that way. There were some challenges that we didn't expect, though, and I think those are really interesting. So one thing, our initial hypothesis was that the person has to be in charge, and they have to decide what widgets to use when, and they have to configure the widgets. So for each widget, there were some things that you could configure, like what questions do I want to ask from this data, or what data to even run this on, and when to use the widget. And we thought that this would be great because we wanted the person to be in the driver's seat. But in the follow-up interviews, people did talk about confirmation bias. Because they were like, if I have this hypothesis that something is going on in this data, if I ask that question, the model will go find the evidence for the thing that I am trying to find, right? Because there's so much data, it has to be somewhere in that data. And so they actually wanted sometimes for the sort of widgets to push back, or for there to be someone to question assumptions and stop them from over-relying. They also worried about over-reliance on these AI-generated insights if someone else on the team was coming up and saying, hey, this is what the UDI widget said, and now there's no conversation, we have to go by whatever the AI said. And they were worried about that might lose some of the depth of understanding that you would get from actually spending hours of reading this stuff and really getting deep into it. They also worried about decision making in high stake settings, requiring human oversight. And one thing that I think is really interesting was that they were talking about how I, as the PM, know things about the business that the AI cannot know because it's not even in the data. Most of what we know contextually and through conversations is actually never recorded anywhere. So there's no way for it to be in any data that could end up in a model. And so there are these things, sometimes we call them human intuition, sometimes it's just the art of, say, products that models just don't have access to, and so that's really important if there's over-reliance on these models for decision making. And so there were 3 key takeaways for what people actually wanted. User control was, of course, one, but they also talked a lot about accountability and ethical consideration. One thing that they loved was that with the widgets, they could look at the same data at different levels of granularity. So the fact that they could pick which widget to use and how to run it and go really deep into the data with question answering or get this high-level overview with just the pain point tracker, that is something that they really liked and I think is a good design pattern as well for other people building tools, or if you're incorporating these kinds of models in your tools. People really like having that granularity of options. They talked a lot about the creativity versus objectivity. I think we're starting to see this a little bit where tools like Grammarly and some of the other generation tools now give you the option of picking your tone, or some of them allow you the option of picking the temperature. The temperature is something really technical in the model. Sometimes it means higher temperature is higher creativity, but what it really means is that high temperature is higher randomness, and sometimes that leads to creativity. So I think we'll see more and more of these sort of granular options and adaptations made available to end users. And they really cared about it being customizable. And I think that's really important, so because each person did something completely different. And so I think that's a big design lesson as we're building more of these tools. They cared a lot about accountability, and I think that's really important. They wanted to know where the outputs come from. Has anyone had experiences with this where you have an AI output and you kind of want to know, okay, but how did it come up with this output or this idea? Have you seen examples of it working well?
Perplexity is.
Can you say more?
That was one of the reasons, I thought Perplexity was different, because it gives you 4 or 5 sources.
It gives you citations.
And then I think the main, key from that was because you use another model, you don't look at the sources, but if you look at the sources, in certain cases, you're like, okay, now I get why, it's having this output. If you look at the sources and say it's all beef industry, it's talking about why beef is kitchen, so.
Right, yeah, so citations has been very successful, yeah.
Right, so the citations or the reasoning kind of develops the trust in the user. For example, like when Gmail tells you this is spam, I don't want to believe that blatantly. I want to understand why did you mark it as spam? Maybe because I deleted the last 5 messages, emails that look like it, and that will give me clarity. Okay, you're doing a good job because you're explaining to me what you're doing and why you're doing it.
Right, yes. So there's been a lot of research into explainability. So when a model produces an output, can we explain how it came up with that output? And sometimes we can. If it's certain kinds of models, we can. But for a lot of the models, and especially the newer ones, the black box ones, there's actually no one knows anything about how it came up with that idea. Now there are some approaches of post hoc explanations, which is, I know that this really great model that's really powerful did this thing, but now another model is going to come up with an explanation for how it got there. And the problem is that the other model might be wrong. And so there's been a lot of debate about whether that's even useful or not. Right,
So how did this model came up with the questions, whether it is a user bias or what kind of questions that you're asking to the users to extract the right information? So how does it work? And also the algorithms that has been used here. So is there any current tool available in the market that can fully extract in that way to prepare and state the data currently?
I I think
Can
there are.
you repeat the question?
Yes.
People are having trouble.
Oh yeah, of course. Thank you for reminding me. So the question is, are there any tools on the market that can do that kind of a thing of, scraping the, am I correct? Scraping the data and then doing that kind of analysis. I think there are a few on the market. I think Syncly is one. There are a few startups that are doing this kind of thing. This was, of course, a research project, so it's actually on GitHub if you want to go run it yourself. But I think explainability was something that everyone wanted, but I'm not sure how much we can actually get there. We did the citations thing. I think that that's always useful, and that's fairly easy to do as long as you know where the data came in. You can just cite it. Yeah.
With some of the LLMs, like I recently did this with ChatGPT, I asked it to explain how it got to its answer. But then it comes back to the veracity, like even within the same model, how trusting can you be that the reasoning game, especially because with temperature and other things, and if it doesn't have, unless there's history that it's really saved the execution plan, for lack of a better word, that it went through.
Yeah.
How accurate is it going to be able to be to explain what it thinks?
Zero accurate. Because so ChatGPT is using transformer models, right? It's billions and billions of parameters, and no one knows how it went. And so asking it post hoc to explain what just happened, it just doesn't have access to that data. So it will come up with something, and that's the big problem, right? It always comes up with something that kind of sounds reasonable, and our brains, we just can't deal with that because we're sort of, it kind of is mimicking another person. And we're socialized and sort of hardwired that when another person tells us something that kind of sounds reasonable, we just accept it. And that's how we've been able to live as social beings for millions of years. And so I think that that's a really big design question, is how do we as product managers and designers create these interactions that explain to the person what is actually going on in a way that they can use it reliably, but that it doesn't become misleading. Yeah.
I think a lot of what this gets to, the projects that I've had is just being able to debug these issues when they come up.
Yeah.
I had issues where I monitored like a custom assistant in OpenAI and like saw a response and I just had no idea how it could have possibly respond or produced that. Try to run the same exact sort of prompts and you can't produce it. Whereas typically in code, we fix a scenario, we can trace the outcome and then fix the issue. A lot of times in the product, that one bad interaction is the bad review in the App Store that can hurt you later on.
Exactly. That's the sort of vibe-based evaluation, right? I always ask people, what is your favorite LLM chatbot? And it's always a mix. Some people love Gemini, and some people love ChatGPT or Perplexity, and I always ask them why. And it's always this one time I asked it to do this thing and it did it wrong, and I asked the other one and it did it right, and then I completely switched. And that's going to be a big problem for product managers, right? Because you're the one who have to then explain to management why you lost this customer because of vibes, and then you have to go tell the ML engineer to fix the vibes. But I think transparency is something that people care a lot about. It builds trust. And so maybe even you don't give the best model to the person right off the bat. Maybe you build trust with them first, with a model that maybe is worse but makes less mistakes. There have been some people who have advocated for not using black box models at all in really high-stakes settings like medicine. So we can have a deep learning model, which we know nothing about how it works, and it can assign medicines with, say, 80% accuracy. Or we can have a deterministic just algorithm that maybe is a little less accurate, but we always know why it did the thing. So a doctor can go look and say, one of my friends, Hima Lakaraju, who's a professor at Harvard, did this study where they built a system, a model, that takes the inputs and outputs of a big black box model and builds a deterministic algorithm that more or less does the same as what the big model does. So these types of algorithms are very common in medicine, where if you go to the emergency room and you present with certain symptoms, usually it's an algorithm. They're like the age of that person, and then it branches off in a flow chart, what are their symptoms, and then they end up with what they should do with you. And so she built a system that builds a flow chart like that, off of how a big model that was trained on a lot of data acts. And it was really cool because then you can go look into it and see, oh, it's discriminating against women on heart attacks. because then you can see how it's coming up with that thing, right? But the thing that it came up with isn't exactly what the big model is doing. It's just an approximation. We think it's doing it that way. But there are people that say in high-stakes settings we shouldn't be using the big black box models at all, and we should stick to things that are deterministic. Now for products, it's a little bit of a different story because sometimes the big black box models are so good that they can lead to, you know, a ChatGPT moment. But then you have to think about what is the worst thing that could happen to a user with this model, and how do I build trust with them when they've just joined? And I think those are all things that we're going to see more and more of. Audit trails were something that people asked for, especially in collaborative settings. That's exactly the sort of, I did the same thing twice and I got two different things, and that becomes a problem if it was your colleague who did it and got one thing and you did it and you got a different thing. And so I think we'll see more and more of sort of accountability measures on top of models. Logging inputs and outputs is something that a lot of companies are doing, and I think we might see more and more of that being made more transparent to end users. The last one was people wanted explainability of what the limitations of the tools are. Just like more, you know, end user education on what it can and cannot do. And I'll end with some ethical considerations that our participants talked about. Privacy and confidentiality was of course a big one. Any kind of enterprise tool is going to deal with that. I think companies have gotten much more privacy aware, and especially with some of the things in the news about OpenAI or other companies, you know, training on people's data, I think they've just become a lot more conscious of that, and that's important. Ways to mitigate the confirmation bias of what the model tells people came up. And they talked a lot about balancing the sort of benefits that they saw coming from automation with the human insights. So they talked about things like, this automation really increases my efficiency, but there needs to be a balance with me and my intuition and my central role as the decision maker. So AI tools is enhancing but not replacing human judgment. So I'll end there with 3 key insights. I think one thing we learned was that the LLMs are super flexible and very unpredictable. So there's a big challenge ahead of us on how do we build products around these models that make use of how powerful the models are, but you know, lead to users actually trusting them and using them reliably. And then we did some comparisons to more deterministic ways to keep data, and one of those is knowledge graphs. So you might have heard a lot of companies are now incorporating different kinds of knowledge bases in addition to LLMs. I think that we'll see a lot more of that kind of a duality, where LLMs or models are very good at language generation, very bad at being reliable, and the other end of that extreme is reliable and deterministic knowledge sources like knowledge graphs. And so I think we'll see more and more combinations of these kinds of things, like user-guided combinations of these kinds of things. So I'll stop there. Thank you so much for listening. And I don't know how, I completely lost track of time too. How much time do we have?
We can do some Q&A.
Yeah, let's do some Q&A. Thank you for listening.
Woo!
As opposed to where I don't have any tolerance for error, right? In those cases, like asking a LLM to do something for me, it's all about what's my risk tolerance at that point. And so I'm just kind of thinking, like, you know, with your the third bullet point and given your research, where do you personally land at? Like, you know, is it about, hey, you just got to know the right tool, depending on what you want to do, and no limitations to live with that? Or are you seeing a push towards, fine, we know that it's got problems, like in terms of being deterministic, but can it be better at taking unstructured data and making it structured, so that from there I can maybe create a more deterministic knowledge graph, what have you, and then get my answers. I'm just kind of curious what you learned about that, specifically around that third bullet.
Yeah, I think we'll go more and more towards the plurality of different kinds of models for different kinds of use cases, and a much better understanding by product people as well as management of what works well where. We do have scenarios where we can absolutely not be wrong, and those scenarios and the models that we use and the structures should be completely different from a system where I just want to get the vibes from these observations we've been getting. And there you can get away with some margin of error, and you can use the models, and the models are very powerful. But I think we'll see more and more of this develop as a sort of science and an art of how to use these models, and there'll be different models for different things. And that, you know, this might be controversial, but I don't see a future of AGI happening ever because of that. Because like different tools are good at different things, and there's no sort of universal one way to do everything. And we have to decide and build up the capacities for the different kinds of problems that we have in different kinds of organizational settings.
Curious about the test that you ran with the 10 product managers. Did you give them any insight on how to determine between cost of speed versus cost of accuracy in the flowcharts they were running?
We gave them an hour and we said, do your best to put together a presentation. You're a product manager at Notion. Here's all the data you have from your users. And so they did completely different things, I think, based off of how they do their work and what's worked for them in the past.
Thank you.
So you talked about confirmation bias. There's also biases that exist in data that represent structural inequities in our world. How do you, and I hadn't thought about this before, but as I started to think about what you're doing and talking about the veracity and is the data reliable, there's also, aside from hallucinations, the fact, and even in the healthcare examples, like a lot of these healthcare knowledge systems have inherited biases from hundreds of years ago around how to treat people, you know, who is more prone to illness than not, that is actually not true and has been proven to be false. So how do you think that comes into the work that you're doing and this whole space?
I'm really glad you asked that question. So I think that's partly why I emphasize transparency and these accountability trails so much, because there will always be bias in the data. And I think one of my friends did this study where they would do a description of a patient and their symptoms and give it to ChatGPT. And the only thing that they would change is the pronoun. So they would say, you know, patient has showing these kinds of symptoms and all that, and then it would either be a he, and then they would end it and see how the LLM finishes it, or a she. And they found really big disparities across different kinds of diagnoses. So men would get diagnosed with a heart attack, women would get diagnosed with a stomachache. And so it's obvious that that's in the data, right? It's not that the LLM wants to misdiagnose people. But then that's why I think it's so important, and I think will become part of product moving forward, is this end user education and transparency. So in some of our work, we did this project where we had actual doctors look at a sentence from a real emergency room discharge instruction and the Google Translate of that sentence. And we would say, you know, would you give this translation to a patient or not? And we tried different kinds of interventions. But the one that worked the best was the one where we trained a secondary evaluation model whose whole job was to guide the person on how to use the first model. And we gave them a lot of information about what kind of data was used to train the evaluation model. Because we had zero idea what was trained to use Google Translate, but we did provide them with explanations on how we trained the evaluation model. And we found that using the evaluation model made them 2 times better at deciding when to rely or not to rely. So our goal was that when the translation is correct, they should, yes, give it to a patient, and if it's wrong, not give it to them. They got 2x better using this evaluation model. But we actually tried the back translation thing as well. And for some of them, we gave them the English, the Chinese, and then back to English with Google's with the same model. That did not improve them at all. And that was really surprising to us, because that was actually official guidance given to physicians on how to use these systems. And so I think transparency, accountability trails, and just education is going to be really important if we're going to be able to use these models in reliable and accountable ways. And sometimes it's just about telling people what the data is and what to expect from the data. Because I think we're all going to get a lot, I think we're already getting so much better at using ChatGPT. And I think we're going to get a lot better at using these different kinds of models as they become more and more embedded.
Thank you so much. Yulofar, is that how to say your name?
Yeah.
Thank you so much for
you.
coming. And as a PM, I would love to get my hands on this tool. So if you have any information about it, let us know. Next slide. So yeah, I wanted to wrap up briefly. We have a product tank survey. If you have a chance, please bring out your cell phone and take a minute to provide some feedback. We are definitely always looking for organizers. I'd love to see more faces here who can help host awesome events like this today. And as an organizer myself, I've found it to be a really great way to meet lots of cool people like yourselves. So thank you. I also wanted to give you a sneak peek about our next event. So on September 11th at 6 o'clock, we will be hosting our next event at Neon Co-working. Our speaker, Deb Dutta, is going to talk about her journey going from a head of product at PayPal to a CEO of her own tech startup, working in the AI space and getting founded, not getting founded, but getting funded by Y Combinator. So super exciting stuff. She'll talk about how to find your passion, your why, and taking the leap of faith, and just navigating all the challenges of being a co-founder, not a co-founder, a solo female immigrant founder. So that's super exciting. And yeah, I think we have until 8:45 here, right? So yes, and last but not least, yeah, thank you very much to our sponsors today, GitHub and Storytel. Did you have something you wanted to say?
One last request. There is a lot of leftover food. If you would please take some with you. If there's a lot of leftover food, if you'd please take some, give it to somebody who's less fortunate that you see outside this beautiful building of ours. You'd be doing us a great favor if you can take as much as you can. Thank you.
Yes, thanks. Thank you all for coming. And once again, thanks to Storytel and thanks to GitHub.
You know somebody who can help us find their this concept.